I spent 43 years believing I knew the woman sleeping beside me, and all it took was one envelope to prove I was wrong. My name is Thomas Walker, and at 71 years old, I thought there were very few surprises left in life. I had spent most of my years believing that hard work, loyalty, and commitment meant something. I believed that if you showed up for the people you loved, if you carried them through the difficult seasons, they would do the same for you. That belief followed me through 4 decades of marriage. It followed me through layoffs, mortgage payments, long nights, family emergencies, and every sacrifice that seemed necessary at the time. And then one quiet Tuesday morning, that belief began to crumble. The day started like any other. The sunlight filtered through the kitchen blinds, casting pale stripes across the oak table Patricia and I had bought when we were newly married. The coffee maker hummed softly in the corner. Outside, a neighbor walked his golden retriever past our mailbox. Everything looked ordinary. Everything felt ordinary. Patricia was visiting a friend across town, and I was alone in the house. I remember enjoying the silence. Retirement had taught me to appreciate small moments. I poured myself a second cup of coffee and carried it into my study. That was when I noticed the envelope. It was sitting on my desk, tucked beneath a stack of utility bills. Plain white. No return address. My name was written across the front in neat handwriting. I almost ignored it. These days, most unexpected mail was advertising or requests for donations. But something about it caught my attention. Maybe it was the weight. Maybe it was instinct. I sat down in my leather chair and opened it carefully. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper. No greeting. No signature. Just one sentence. If you want to know who your wife really is, start by looking at what happened in 1998. I read it twice. Then 3 times. The room suddenly felt quieter than before. I stared at the words while my coffee cooled in my hand. 1998. The year meant something. I just couldn't immediately place it. My mind drifted through old memories. We had been married 15 years by then. Daniel was a teenager. I was working 60-hour weeks managing construction projects across 3 counties. Patricia often complained that I was never home enough. We argued sometimes, but what married couple didn't? I folded the paper and slipped it back into the envelope. For several minutes, I simply sat there listening to the ticking wall clock. It sounded louder than usual, slower somehow. I told myself the note was nonsense. A prank. A mistake. Maybe even something intended for someone else. But a strange feeling settled in my chest. Not fear. Not anger. Something colder. Doubt. The kind that arrives quietly and refuses to leave. I walked through the house that afternoon seeing everything differently. The framed photographs on the hallway wall. The vacations. The anniversaries. The smiling faces frozen behind glass. They looked unchanged, yet somehow distant. Like artifacts from a story I wasn't entirely sure belonged to me anymore. When Patricia returned home that evening, she greeted me with the same warm smile she had worn for years. She kissed my cheek and asked what I wanted for dinner. I smiled back. I answered normally. I never mentioned the envelope. Instead, I watched. For the first time in a very long time, I truly watched. And as she moved around the kitchen talking about her day, I realized something unsettling. I couldn't remember the last time I had questioned anything she told me. That night, long after Patricia had fallen asleep, I sat alone in the darkness of our living room with the envelope resting on the coffee table beside me. The note was only 1 sentence long, yet it had already changed everything. Because for the first time in 43 years, I found myself wondering whether the life I remembered was the same life I had actually lived. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the envelope sitting on the coffee table. By dawn, I was standing in the kitchen staring out at the backyard while the coffee brewed. The grass needed mowing. The bird feeder was nearly empty. Ordinary things. The kind of things that had filled my mornings for years. Yet none of them felt ordinary anymore. Patricia came downstairs around 7:30, wearing her favorite blue robe. She smiled when she saw me and reached for a coffee mug. I watched her pour cream into her cup exactly the way she always did. 2 spoonfuls. A slow stir. A small sip before sitting down. 43 years together had taught me every detail of her routines. Or at least I thought it had. "You are up early," she said. "Could not sleep," I replied. She nodded sympathetically and began talking about a lunch she planned to have later that week with an old friend. I listened carefully. There was nothing unusual in her voice. Nothing suspicious. Just the familiar rhythm of a woman I had spent most of my life loving. After breakfast, Patricia left to run errands. The moment her car disappeared down the street, I walked into my study and opened a storage cabinet that had not been touched in years. If the note mentioned 1998, then that was where I would start. The cabinet held dozens of old boxes, tax records, family photographs, insurance paperwork, school documents from Daniel's childhood. Dust coated the corners. The cardboard smelled faintly of age and attic insulation. I spent nearly 2 hours sorting through files. At first, I found nothing. Then I came across a photo album labeled Summer 1998. I carried it to my desk and opened it slowly. There was Daniel at 14 years old holding a fishing rod at Lake Cumberland. There was Patricia smiling beside a rented cabin. There was me standing next to an old pickup truck I had owned back then. I remembered that trip. I had only been able to stay for 3 days because of a construction project in Cincinnati. Patricia and Daniel remained at the lake for nearly 2 weeks after I returned to work. I turned another page. Then another. Something felt strange. Not wrong exactly. Just incomplete. Several photo sleeves were empty. The album skipped nearly 4 days. I frowned. Patricia had always been meticulous about organizing family photographs. Missing pages made no sense. I searched the box for loose pictures, but found nothing. Around noon, I sat back in my chair and rubbed my eyes. Maybe I was chasing shadows. Maybe a random note had convinced me to see mysteries where none existed. Yet the feeling remained. The same cold doubt that had settled inside me the day before. Later that afternoon, I drove to a small diner on the edge of town. It was a place I had frequented for years. The waitress knew my name. The coffee was always hot. The pie display had not changed in decades. I ordered a turkey sandwich and sat alone in a corner booth. While waiting for my meal, I found myself thinking about the man I had been in 1998. I worked 60 hours a week, sometimes more. Every promotion, every bonus, every extra project had one purpose: building a better life for my family. Patricia never asked me to work that hard, at least not directly, but I wanted her to have everything I never had growing up: a comfortable home, financial security, freedom from worry. Looking back now, I realized something unsettling. I could remember every sacrifice I had made for our future, yet I could not clearly remember what Patricia had been doing during many of those long years when I was always away. For the first time, that question refused to leave my mind. 3 days passed before anything unusual happened. During that time, I continued searching through old records whenever Patricia was out of the house. I told myself I was simply satisfying a curiosity that had gotten out of hand. Yet every evening, I found myself returning to the study, opening another box, reading another document, hoping to find something that would explain the anonymous note. Instead, I found only fragments, small inconsistencies, tiny gaps in memories I had never questioned before. On Friday afternoon, the doorbell rang while Patricia was attending a gardening club meeting. I was in the garage organizing tools when I heard it. The visitor was a woman about my age. She had short gray hair, a navy jacket, and the cautious expression of someone unsure whether they should continue a conversation they had already started. "Thomas Walker?" she asked. "That is me." She nodded slowly. "My name is Margaret Collins." The name meant nothing to me. Seeing my confusion, she offered a polite smile. I knew Patricia years ago. Something tightened inside my chest. Not fear. Anticipation. "Would you like to come in?" I asked. Margaret hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. We sat at the kitchen table. Sunlight spilled across the countertop. The refrigerator hummed softly in the background. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Margaret folded her hands together and looked down. "I almost turned around 3 times before knocking on your door," she said quietly. "Then why did you?" Her eyes met mine. "Because there are things you deserve to know." The words settled heavily between us. I remained silent. Years of managing construction crews had taught me that people often reveal more when given space to speak. Margaret took a slow breath. "Patricia and I were friends many years ago. Not close friends, but close enough." I waited. Around 1998, we spent time together through a volunteer organization, community events, fundraisers, things like that. Hearing the year immediately sharpened my attention. Margaret noticed. "You know that year means something." It was not a question. "Someone recently suggested I look into it." I replied carefully. She nodded as though that confirmed something for her. "Then perhaps the truth is finally catching up." I felt my pulse quicken. Margaret reached into her purse and removed an old photograph. The edges were worn. The colors slightly faded. She slid it across the table toward me. I picked it up. At first glance, it appeared ordinary. A group of adults standing together at an outdoor charity event. Folding tables. White tents. Smiling faces. Then I noticed Patricia. She looked younger, of course. Her hair was darker. Her smile brighter. Standing beside her was a man I had never seen before. They appeared comfortable together. Familiar. More familiar than strangers posing for a photograph. Who is he? I asked. Margaret looked toward the window. His name was Richard Hale. I studied the picture again. Margaret nodded. He moved away years ago. The room seemed unusually quiet. What exactly are you trying to tell me? I asked. Margaret did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked directly at me with an expression that felt more sympathetic than judgmental. Thomas, I am not here to accuse anyone. I am here because I carried something for a very long time and recently learned you still do not know about it. My grip tightened slightly on the photograph. Know about what? She exhaled slowly. Back then, people talked. Rumors mostly. But there were enough of them that many of us believed something important was being hidden. Patricia spent a great deal of time with Richard during periods when you were traveling for work. I stared at her. My first instinct was disbelief. My second was anger at myself for feeling surprised. Because deep down, ever since the envelope arrived, I had sensed that whatever happened in 1998 was not going to be simple. Margaret reached across the table and gently tapped the photograph. I cannot prove anything, but I think this is where your answers begin. As she stood to leave, she paused near the front door. Be careful what you look for, Thomas. Sometimes the hardest part is not discovering the truth. It is realizing how long you have been living without it. After she left, I remained seated at the kitchen table for nearly an hour. The photograph rested in front of me. Outside, a lawnmower started somewhere down the street. A dog barked in the distance. Normal sounds. Normal life. Yet nothing felt normal anymore. Because for the first time, the mystery was no longer an anonymous note. It had a face. It had a name. And it had followed me all the way back to 1998. That evening, I placed the photograph back inside its envelope and slid it into the bottom drawer of my desk just before Patricia came home. I heard her car pull into the driveway. The garage door rumbled open. A few seconds later, her footsteps crossed the kitchen floor. Everything sounded familiar, predictable, yet I found myself listening differently now, as though every ordinary sound might contain a clue I had missed for decades. Patricia walked into the living room carrying a small shopping bag and smiling about some sale she had found at a local garden center. I smiled back. I asked questions. I acted exactly as I always had. But for the first time in our marriage, I paid attention to the spaces between her words. Later, that night, after dinner, she settled into her usual chair and watched one of her favorite television programs. I sat nearby pretending to read. In reality, I was studying her expressions, her mannerisms, the ease with which she moved through our routine. If she was carrying a secret, she carried it remarkably well. Around 10 o'clock, Patricia headed upstairs. I remained in the living room for another hour. My mind drifted backward through years I had not examined in a long time. The more I thought about 1998, the more details surfaced. Small details, strange details, things I had dismissed because I trusted her completely. Back then, my work kept me on the road constantly. Some months, I spent more nights in hotels than at home. Patricia often complained about the travel. She said she felt lonely. I remembered feeling guilty about that. I remembered buying flowers from airport gift shops and calling every evening from job sites across Ohio and Kentucky. I remembered trying. Then another memory surfaced. Patricia had suddenly become very involved in community projects during that period. Charity drives, volunteer events, fundraisers. At the time, I was proud of her. I liked seeing her build friendships and interests outside the house. Yet now I realized something odd. I could not name a single person from those groups. Not one. For years, I never found that unusual. Another memory appeared. One summer afternoon, I returned home unexpectedly because a project had been delayed by severe weather. Patricia had seemed startled when I walked through the front door. Not upset, not angry, just surprised. I remembered joking about catching her off guard. She laughed and blamed the messy kitchen. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Now the memory lingered longer than it should have. The following morning, Patricia left early for breakfast with a friend. As soon as she was gone, I climbed into the attic. The space was crowded with old boxes and forgotten belongings. Christmas decorations, camping equipment, Daniel's childhood science projects. I spent nearly 2 hours searching through containers from the late 1990s. Most held exactly what I expected: bills, receipts, old greeting cards. Then I discovered a cardboard box tucked behind several storage bins. It contained dozens of photographs that had never been placed into albums. I carried the box downstairs and began sorting through them one by one. Family gatherings, school events, vacation snapshots. Then I found another image from the same charity event Margaret had mentioned. Patricia stood near a registration table. Several volunteers surrounded her. The man from the previous photograph was there again. Richard Hale. This time, however, someone had written notes on the back. Names, dates, event locations. Beneath Richard's name was a phone number. My eyes remained fixed on those digits for several seconds. The handwriting belonged to Patricia. I recognized it instantly. My pulse quickened. Not because the photograph proved anything. It did not. But because it was the first physical piece of evidence connecting her directly to a man whose existence had never once been mentioned during 43 years of marriage. I sat quietly at the kitchen table holding that photograph while sunlight moved slowly across the floor. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang noon. And for the first time, I began to wonder whether the answers I was searching for were still waiting to be found, or whether they had been sitting unnoticed inside my own house all along. The phone number stayed on my mind for the rest of the afternoon. I did not call it. Part of me wanted answers immediately. Another part feared what those answers might be. Instead, I placed the photograph beside the others I had collected and began building a timeline. Yellow legal pads covered my desk. Dates, locations, notes from old receipts and photographs. The process reminded me of managing construction projects years ago. Large jobs were never understood all at once. You examined one detail at a time until the full picture emerged. By evening, several patterns had started to appear. Most involved periods when I had been traveling extensively for work. During those years, I was rarely home for more than a few days at a time. Looking back through old calendars, I noticed something strange. Patricia's volunteer activities seemed to increase whenever my travel schedule became heavier. Again, it proved nothing. Yet the coincidence appeared repeatedly. The following morning, I drove to the public library. I had not visited in years. The building looked smaller than I remembered. The same brick exterior. The same oak trees shading the parking lot. Inside, the scent of books and old paper brought back memories of taking Daniel there as a child. I approached the reference desk and asked about archived local newspapers from the late 1990s. A helpful librarian directed me toward a digital archive system. For nearly 3 hours, I searched articles connected to community events and charity organizations from that period. Most were routine announcements, fundraisers, volunteer drives, holiday programs. Then I found several photographs from local newspaper coverage. Patricia appeared in more than one article. So did Richard Hale. Sometimes they stood with larger groups. Sometimes they appeared side by side during award presentations and community projects. Again, there was nothing inappropriate, nothing dramatic. Yet one detail stood out. Richard's name appeared repeatedly over nearly 3 years. Patricia had apparently worked with him far longer than I realized. Long enough that his complete absence from our family history now seemed unusual. On the drive home, I stopped at a gas station and bought a bottle of water. While sitting in the parking lot, I pulled out my phone and searched for Richard Hale. Several results appeared. Most were outdated. One article mentioned a business relocation more than 20 years earlier. Another referenced community development work in a neighboring state. Then I found something else. An old business directory listing. The address caught my attention immediately. It was located less than 15 miles from one of the apartment complexes where I had managed a long-term construction project in 1998. I stared at the screen. Back then, I spent months working nearby without ever knowing the name Richard Hale. The coincidence felt uncomfortable. That evening, Patricia and I had dinner with our son Daniel and his wife Melissa. It was the first family gathering since the envelope arrived. Daniel talked about work. Melissa shared stories about their teenage daughter learning to drive. Everyone laughed. Everyone seemed relaxed. I smiled when appropriate. I asked questions. Yet throughout the meal, I found myself studying Patricia from across the table. She looked completely at ease. There was no sign she suspected anything. No sign she carried decades of hidden history. At one point, Daniel mentioned an old family vacation from the late 1990s. Patricia laughed and corrected a detail about the hotel we stayed in. The memory came to her instantly, effortlessly. Watching her, I realized something that unsettled me even more than the photograph. Patricia possessed an extraordinary memory for our shared life. Birthdays, anniversaries, trips, conversations. She remembered everything, which meant if Richard Hale had truly played an important role during those years, forgetting to mention him was not an accident. After dinner, we returned home. Patricia went upstairs early, complaining of a mild headache. I remained in the study. The legal pads lay scattered across my desk. The photographs rested beside them. For a long time, I simply sat there staring at the timeline I had assembled. Then I noticed something I had overlooked. A 3-month gap during the summer of 1999. No photographs. No volunteer records. No notes. Nothing at all. Just empty space. And somehow, that empty space felt more important than everything I had found so far. The next morning, I focused on that gap from the summer of 1999. 3 months should have left traces. Receipts. Photographs. Bank statements. Something. Instead, it was as if that period had been carefully erased from the story of our family. I began pulling old financial records from storage boxes in the basement. Most of the documents were exactly what I expected. Utility bills, mortgage payments, credit card statements, ordinary pieces of a life built over decades. Then I found an old checking account register that Patricia used to maintain by hand before online banking became common. The pages were filled with her familiar handwriting. Every grocery trip, every household expense, every deposit. I turned page after page until I reached the summer of 1999. That was when I noticed several withdrawals that stood out from the rest. They were not large enough to attract attention at the time. A few $100s here, a few $100s there. But together they added up to several $1,000s over 3 months. The descriptions were vague. Cash withdrawal, transfer, miscellaneous expense. Looking at them now, I realized something uncomfortable. During that period, I had been working on a major project nearly 300 miles away. I was rarely home. If Patricia had explained those expenses back then, I would have accepted her explanation without question. Later that afternoon, I drove to the county records office. I told myself I was only gathering information, nothing more. Yet each step seemed to pull me deeper into a story I no longer controlled. Using public archives, I searched for property records connected to Richard Hale. Most led nowhere. Then one address caught my attention. A small house purchased in late 1998 and sold several years later. What made me pause was not the property itself. It was the location. The house sat less than 10 minutes from the volunteer center where Patricia had spent so much of her time. I printed the record and carried it back to my car. For several minutes, I simply sat behind the wheel staring at the paper. My reflection looked older than I remembered. Not because of age, because certainty was leaving me. That evening, Patricia prepared dinner as she always did. She talked about a neighbor's new landscaping project and a recipe she wanted to try over the weekend. I listened carefully. Her voice sounded warm, familiar, comforting even. More than once, I found myself hoping there was an innocent explanation for everything. Perhaps Margaret had been mistaken. Perhaps the anonymous note came from someone with an old grudge. Perhaps I was connecting dots that were never meant to connect. But after dinner, while Patricia was upstairs folding laundry, the telephone rang. I answered it. There was no response at first, just silence. Then an older man's voice spoke quietly. "You have been asking questions about Richard Hale." My grip tightened around the receiver. "Who is this?" I asked. The caller ignored the question. "If you want the truth, stop looking at photographs and start looking at hospital records from August of 1999. Before I could say another word, the line went dead. I remained standing in the kitchen, holding the silent receiver long after the call ended. Because for the second time, someone I had never met seemed to know more about my marriage than I did. The next morning, I could not stop thinking about the phone call. Hospital records from August of 1999. It sounded oddly specific. Too specific to be random. After Patricia left to meet a friend for coffee, I drove across town to the County Medical Records Archive. Access to private records was restricted, of course, but older public references and administrative filings sometimes appeared in related databases. I was not searching for confidential information. I was searching for context. Something that might explain why a stranger believed that month mattered. Hours passed. Most of my searches led nowhere. Then I found a newspaper notice mentioning a fundraising campaign organized by a local hospital during the summer of 1999. Several volunteers were listed by name. Patricia's name appeared on the committee. So did Richard Hale's. I leaned back in my chair. Another coincidence. Another connection. Another thread leading back to the same place. On my way home, I stopped at a small diner near the highway. The lunch crowd had already left. Only a few customers remained. I ordered coffee and sat near the window. The waitress refilled my cup twice while I stared at the notes I had gathered over the past week. Photographs, dates, newspaper clippings, financial records. None of them proved anything on their own. Yet together they formed a picture I could no longer ignore. Patricia had shared a significant part of her life with someone whose name had never once been mentioned to me. 43 years of marriage. Thousands of conversations. Not one reference. That silence felt heavier than any evidence. When I arrived home, I found Patricia in the backyard, trimming roses. She looked peaceful beneath the afternoon sun. For a moment, I simply watched her through the kitchen window. I remembered the first house we bought together. I remembered painting nurseries, paying bills, celebrating birthdays, worrying about college tuition, planning retirement. Real memories. Good memories. That was what made everything so difficult. Nothing about our life felt fake. Yet something important had clearly been hidden inside it. That evening, while Patricia showered upstairs, I opened a drawer in the guest bedroom where we stored old address books. Most belonged to her. They contained names collected over decades. Friends, neighbors, former co-workers. I carefully turned the pages. Then I found it. Richard Hale. Not crossed out. Not forgotten. His name remained neatly written in Patricia's handwriting alongside an address and an old telephone number. My pulse quickened. Why keep his contact information for decades if he had only been a casual acquaintance? I photographed the page with my phone and returned the address book exactly where I found it. Later that night, Patricia sat beside me on the couch watching television. She laughed at a joke from a sitcom we had seen many times before. I laughed too. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Inwardly, everything had. Because for the first time since this began, I realized I was no longer searching for a single answer. I was uncovering an entire chapter of my wife's life that had been carefully kept separate from mine. And somewhere inside that hidden chapter, I was beginning to suspect, lay the reason someone had sent that envelope in the first place. 2 days later, I drove to the address I had found in Patricia's old address book. The neighborhood sat on the edge of a small town about 40 minutes from our house. It was quiet. Modest homes. Mature trees. Well-kept lawns. Nothing about it stood out. I parked across the street from the property once connected to Richard Hale and remained in my car for several minutes. The house had changed owners years ago, but I wanted to see it for myself. Sometimes places reveal things that documents cannot. Eventually, I walked down the sidewalk and studied the neighborhood. A retired man watering flowers in his front yard greeted me with a friendly wave. We exchanged a few words. Then, as naturally as possible, I mentioned the previous owner. To my surprise, he remembered the name immediately. Richard, he said. That takes me back. Nice fellow. Kept to himself mostly. I nodded. Did he have family? The man thought for a moment. Not that I remember, though he had visitors now and then. One woman came around pretty often back then. My chest tightened slightly. I kept my expression neutral. Do you remember her name? He shook his head. No, that was a long time ago. He smiled apologetically and returned to watering his flowers. It was not much, yet it was enough to confirm something important. Patricia had not simply crossed paths with Richard once or twice. Their connection had lasted long enough for neighbors to notice. On the drive home, I stopped at a small coffee shop and reviewed everything I had gathered. The anonymous letter, Margaret's visit, the photographs, the financial records, the address book, the phone call. Individually, each piece seemed incomplete. Together, they formed a pattern that was becoming difficult to dismiss. That evening, I made a decision. Instead of continuing to chase fragments from the past, I would find someone who might know the full story. I searched through old newspaper archives again and eventually located the name of a former director from the volunteer organization Patricia had worked with in the late 1990s. After several phone calls, I managed to reach him. His name was Harold Benson. He was 82 years old now and living in a retirement community outside Columbus. At first, he sounded cautious. Then I mentioned Patricia and Richard. Silence filled the line. Long silence. The kind that says more than words ever could. Finally, Harold spoke. I wondered if this day would ever come. My hand tightened around the phone. What do you mean? Another pause followed. I could hear him breathing softly. Thomas, there are conversations that should have happened many years ago. My pulse began to race. Then let us have one now. Harold sighed heavily. Not over the phone. Some things deserve to be explained face to face. We arranged to meet 3 days later. After ending the call, I sat alone in my study staring at the dark window beside my desk. Upstairs, Patricia moved quietly through our bedroom preparing for bed. The familiar sounds of our home surrounded me. Yet for the first time, they felt like echoes from a life I no longer fully understood. Because whatever Harold planned to tell me, I knew one thing with certainty. The answers were finally within reach. 3 days later, I drove to the retirement community just outside Columbus. The morning sky was overcast, and the highway seemed longer than usual. Harold Benson was waiting in a small lounge near the front entrance. He looked older than I expected, thinner too, but his eyes were sharp. After a brief handshake, we sat across from each other in 2 upholstered chairs. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then Harold looked down at his folded hands and sighed. I have regretted this for years, he said quietly. Regretted what? I asked. He met my eyes. Not telling you the truth when I first realized you did not know it. My stomach tightened. Harold explained that during the late 1990s, Patricia and Richard had become extremely close while working together on community projects. Their friendship was well known inside the organization. Many people assumed you were aware of it because Patricia often spoke about her husband traveling for work and rarely being home. Was there more than friendship? I asked. Harold paused before answering. I never witnessed anything inappropriate. What I did witness was secrecy, meetings that were never mentioned, conversations that stopped when others entered the room, plans made without explanation. He reached into a folder beside his chair and removed several photocopied documents. One of them immediately caught my attention. It was a volunteer registration form from August 1999. Patricia and Richard had listed the same emergency contact address for a temporary project assignment. I stared at the page in silence. The address matched the neighborhood I had visited days earlier. Why send me the envelope? I finally asked. Harold shook his head. I did not, but I think I know who did. He explained that Richard had passed away several years earlier. Before his death, he had apparently shared documents and personal records with a distant relative. According to Harold, that relative recently began sorting through old belongings and discovered materials that raised questions about events from long ago. The envelope, he believed, was someone trying to bring unfinished truths into the light. On the drive home, I felt strangely calm. Not relieved, not angry, simply clear. For weeks, I had been chasing certainty. Instead, I found something more important. Perspective. That evening, I sat with Patricia at the kitchen table after dinner. For the first time since this began, I placed the photographs, records, and notes between us. She looked at them quietly. Then she closed her eyes. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft. She admitted that she had hidden an important friendship from me for years because she feared how it would look and what questions it might create. What began as secrecy eventually became a habit, then a burden, then a wall she no longer knew how to remove. We talked for hours. About trust, about pride, about mistakes, about the damage created by silence. Some answers brought peace. Others did not. But as midnight approached, I realized the greatest lie was not a single event from decades ago. It was the belief that a marriage could survive forever without complete honesty. The next morning, I walked into my study and placed the envelope into a drawer. I did not need it anymore. Whatever remained unresolved belonged to the past. I had spent my life carrying responsibilities, expectations, and assumptions. Now, for the first time in years, I chose something different. I chose the truth, however imperfect it might be. And that choice felt lighter than anything I had carried before.